Hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're reacting to the Big Ten, specifically in Week 7, and boy, is there a lot to talk about. But before we get into that, it is at this point I would like to ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. If you did, it would really help out me and the channel. So now with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to get started by starting with the 4 teams that I have in the treading water tier. The only 4 teams in the treading water tier this week are the 4 teams that had byes: Michigan State, Indiana, Nebraska, and Michigan. I'll start with Michigan State here. My opinion on Michigan State is still the team that, if they made a bowl game, they would be ahead of schedule. This is a team that has played significantly better than I thought it would early on in the season. However, this is also a team that has a significantly harder schedule than I anticipated it being. Like, I knew you were going to lose to Ohio State. I knew you were going to lose to Oregon. I figured you would lose to Michigan. But now all of a sudden, Indiana is a tough game. Now all of a sudden, Illinois is a tough game. I mean, hell, even Rutgers isn't a gimme at the end of the season. This was always a team that was looking more towards next year and the year after, as opposed to this year. However, even if they do end up 4-8 or 5-7, this is still a team and a season that I would consider a success. If I had to guess, I think you could probably win one of Iowa or Rutgers, and then I think you probably beat Purdue. I think it's very likely that you end up 5-7, and gun to my head, that is what I would predict. However, you absolutely could beat Michigan. It's not beyond the possibility that you could pull off an upset against Illinois or Indiana, although I do think it would be unlikely, but that doesn't mean a whole lot in college football. This is a team, pretty much regardless of every other game other than the Michigan game, where I don't really care if you win or lose. And if I'm a Michigan State fan, which I'm not, but if I was a Michigan State fan, I would be very encouraged with the way that this season is going. Not as encouraged as either Indiana or Nebraska, who I'm going to lump together here because they play each other this week. But if I'm Michigan State, I'm still looking like, oh, we've got the right coach. It just might take a little bit to get going. Moving on to Indiana and Nebraska here. No one alive thought Indiana was going to be this good. Quite a few people thought Nebraska would be this good. This is a quality Nebraska team that I think is maybe a year away from being able to win the big games. And what do I mean by the big games for Nebraska? I mean Ohio State, Oregon, potentially Michigan, potentially a USC. So those are probably like the big 4, so to speak, in the Big Ten. They're the 4 biggest brands. Traditionally, they would be the 4 best teams in the Big Ten year in and year out. So if Nebraska is going to compete with a sort of traditional, 10-2 caliber Michigan team and a national championship competing Ohio State team and a national championship competing Oregon team, they're not there yet. I think they're a year away. I think they are definitely someone that needs to look into the transfer portal for offensive weapons, whether that be a tight end or a wide receiver. I do understand that they have some young guys there that look like they could potentially step up in the future. However, I'm not going to rely on that. If I'm this team, I'm going to go out in the transfer portal and I'm going to try to find me a wide receiver. When it comes to Indiana, you're playing with house money at this point. You're already bowl eligible. You can end the season 8-4, and I don't think very many people are going to care. Now, I don't think you're going to end the season 8-4. I think you've got a very good chance at 10-2. However, that depends upon this game and also the Michigan and Washington games. Those are the 3 games that I'm circling for Indiana, and it's like you need to win 2 of those games if you want to get to that double-digit win margin in the regular season. However, I will say this for Indiana. I'm not positive what this team is going to look like next year. I think Curt Cignetti is, at this point, one of the better coaches in all of college football and one of the best coaches in the Big Ten. Fact of the matter is that unless you're a really good coach, Indiana doesn't look like this. They just don't. And they have dominated every game that they've been in for the most part, which is not something anybody else in the Big Ten can say. It's just a fact of reality at this point. If this was last week, I would have said Ohio State also could have said that, but they lost to Oregon this past week. So the question with the Indiana team is, this game is at home. Washington is at home. Michigan is at home. Can you win all three? If you can, you're going to be undefeated heading to Ohio State. And man, that all of a sudden becomes a real important football game. Now, if you're Indiana, you can't be looking ahead, especially past this Nebraska team that I think is actually built to handle what you do well offensively. And I don't want to get into a preview of matchups here. I'm going to do that on Friday. But these are two teams that are in similar but different positions. Like, I don't think it would shock anybody if Indiana, barely became bowl eligible next year. Because, they did kind of bring in a lot of transfers. But Curt Cignetti is clearly the correct coach for this team right now. And I do see a lot of Indiana fans on Twitter, which is not something I'm used to saying. However, I do see a lot of Indiana fans on Twitter being like, hey, we got to pay to keep this guy around. There is not enough money in the world to keep this coach at Indiana if a school like, Florida State or Ole Miss or, hell, potentially Michigan decides to go to him and say, hey, why don't you come here? It's just a fact of reality. You're in the bottom part of the Power 5 or the Power 4 now. It's just a reality of being a team in that sort of area of college football. Moving on to the last team in the treading water tier, and that is Michigan. And me, being a Michigan fan, obviously, I've been kind of ripping this team apart. However, the fact remains that if Michigan had a quarterback, they probably beat Washington. Because then the pressure isn't on the run game so much. They're not going to be loading the boxes. And Michigan can probably run the football and make some plays in the pass game enough to beat Washington, even though traveling 2 time zones is a ridiculously hard thing to do, especially in the middle of the season. And I think when I went on my rant about them a week ago, I didn't particularly take that into account as much as I should have, in all honesty. Because traveling to the West Coast, even though that's what the Big Ten is now, is an absolutely stupid thing to do. It puts a tremendous advantage on the home team. Like, I think that's a major reason why Michigan lost to Washington. I also think it's a major reason why Washington lost to Rutgers, who then got destroyed by Wisconsin the following week. I think it also played a major reason why Penn State struggled so much against a vastly inferior USC team, in my opinion. I also think that it's a very large reason why Ohio State lost to Oregon. It's not the biggest reason, but I think it's a big one that you can't ignore. So, even though I am on the verge of being fully out on Sharon Moore, in all honesty, if he can beat Illinois, Michigan State, and Indiana, because we're probably going to lose to Oregon and we're probably going to lose to Ohio State, if he can win his other 4 games and go 4-2 in the second half of this season after the bye week to maybe figure some shit out, then perhaps I can be back in on Sharon Moore. Now, at this point, 8-4 was always the realistic worst-case scenario for this team heading into this season. So if they lose more than that, I'm going to be out. But that's a problem for if we end up losing more than 4 games this season. I'd also have to see who the coordinator hires are, because we're likely going to get 2 new coordinators after this season, unless Sharon Moore is far more incompetent than even I'm expecting him to be. So there is still some hope. And if Michigan can come out and beat Illinois, but more importantly, look like a competent football team, which is not something they have looked like for a single football game this year, then all of a sudden Oregon traveling 2 time zones to come play us in Ann Arbor looks like a, raise your eyebrow a little bit kind of game, where, probably not, but maybe. Moving on to the Scarlett Johansson tier. Why is this called the Scarlett Johansson tier? Well, because these teams are looking pretty. The 4 teams in the Scarlett Johansson tier this week are Oregon, Wisconsin, Penn State, and Iowa. Also, special shout out to Northwestern, who we're going to talk about in the next tier, but they were very close to being in the Scarlett Johansson tier. However, I decided to just keep this tier to these 4 teams. Obviously, the big story is Oregon and beating the number 2 team in the country, Ohio State, and also doing it when pretty much every break in the game went towards Ohio State. We talk about the interception. That's the big one. That's obvious. That's 7 points that Ohio State does not score if it's called correctly. However, there were also a ton of little mistakes here or there, penalties, etc., where it kind of benefited Ohio State more than it did Oregon. However, also to balance that take out a little bit, Ohio State was also traveling 2 time zones, so they probably weren't at their best. And in a potential Big Ten championship rematch, guess where you're going to have to travel, Oregon? That's right, you're going to have to go to Indiana, which you're doing this week, ironically enough, and you're traveling 2 time zones this time. Even though I don't particularly think that'll be that big of a deal in the Purdue game, it might be. Emotional win, short week, you're traveling to the Eastern time zone. I think Purdue is in the Eastern time zone. They might be in the Central time zone. I don't know. Either way, it's a lot of travel. That's a game that you maybe got circled if you're a bettor and the numbers get released here pretty soon. Now, I'm not that, so I don't particularly care. I do think Oregon will win. I also think it'll be closer than people think it's going to be. Nevertheless, that was a program-building win for Dan Lanning, who has gotten close to making the playoff and being a national contender a couple times during his career, but has never gotten over the hump. Now, you will likely have to play either Penn State or Ohio State in a Big Ten rematch, assuming you can handle business the rest of the season, which you should be able to do, as you take Illinois, which might be the toughest game left on your schedule, in Oregon at home. You also have Maryland at home, and you end the season with Washington at home. The other 2 games, you go to Wisconsin, who all of a sudden isn't looking like the pushover I thought it might be after the first couple of weeks of the season, and Michigan at home. That's just that might be a game that is tough because of how far you have to travel, and also Michigan might be a better team at that point. I talked about that in the treading water tier a little bit. But this is a team that should end up 12-0 in the regular season, if I'm being honest with you. I'd give you like a 95% chance to beat Purdue. I'd give you like an 80% chance to beat Illinois at home. I'd say like 65 to beat Michigan on the road. I would say like 99 to beat Maryland at home. I would say like 75 to beat Wisconsin on the road. That game is tough, though. And then Washington at home, rivalry game, you never know, but it's probably 50-50 worst case scenario. So this is a team that should end up 12-0. Now, if you drop one game, it's not the end of the world. You have the tiebreaker over Ohio State. And none of the teams that you are playing, including Illinois, are likely going to be in that Big Ten championship conversation at the end of the year. They're probably going to have more than one conference loss. All in all, this team is sitting pretty to make the Big Ten championship game, which is why you're in the Scarlett Johansson tier. Moving on to Penn State. Why are you in the Scarlett Johansson tier? You struggled with a inferior team in USC. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. But they also had to travel from the eastern half of Pennsylvania all the way to Southern California. That is a ridiculously hard trip to make. They effectively lost an entire day of practice, and USC was fighting for the life of their football program in this game. And Penn State still managed to win. That game's in Happy Valley. I think it's a blowout. Genuinely. I think Penn State blows out USC in Happy Valley. So I'm actually thoroughly impressed with the fact that they came away with a victory in that game. Wisconsin destroyed Rutgers at home this week, and I did not see that coming at all. I thought that was going to be a close game. Wisconsin could have won, but I thought it was going to be a close game. It wasn't. You murdered a well-coached Rutgers team. And it wasn't even like Rutgers was just making a ton of mistakes. They weren't even really. You just dominated the game. This is a team that you have to watch out for heading forward. They appear to have turned the corner during that first half against USC. And yes, USC came out and dominated the second half. However, that first half was a proof of concept, and I think the team started believing in itself at that point. They're 2-0, 2 blowout games the past 2 weeks. You've got Northwestern this week, assuming you can handle business there. You then invite Penn State to Camp Randall. It is also worth noting at this point that Penn State is coming off a bye for that game. If not, that would be the trap game of trap games. However, flat out and straight up, if you keep playing like you have been the past few weeks, that's going to be a football game. But even if you lose that game, you're 5-3. You go to Iowa, rivalry game. Don't know what can happen there. Let's say you get that W. You then invite Oregon to Wisconsin. Lots of travel for Oregon. Fighting for their lives potentially at that point. Oregon. Who knows? Who knows? Then you end the season at Nebraska, home against Minnesota. A pseudo rivalry game with Nebraska and a rivalry game with Minnesota. Don't really know what can happen there. Wisconsin, Nebraska, very similar teams. But in all honesty, I would probably lean towards Nebraska slightly, like maybe 55-45 in Nebraska's favor. But that's absolutely a game you can win. And if you can end the season 8-4, that is a big win for this program. And perhaps a sign that Luke Fickell is going to get this team where you want it to be. And finally, we have Iowa. Iowa football destroyed Washington this past week. I did not think Washington was going to lose that game. Genuinely, I did not. I thought Washington was going to win that game. I borderline considered it a lock. I was not impressed with Iowa in any of the games that I watched of them this year. I don't even really particularly think Iowa State is all that good of a football team. But they are, 6 or 7-0 at this point and ranked inside the top 10. So you going toe-to-toe with them says a lot more about you than it does about them, in my opinion. All in all, this is probably a much better team than I have been giving you credit for. However, you still have massive problems, and I don't think the offense is very good. Moving on to the next tier, I call this the good tier because there was good here. So we'll start with Northwestern. Obviously, blowout W, big deal. This program is what I thought it was, which is a well-coached team that is probably never going to be better than 7-5 or maybe 8-4. However, that win put you into the conversation surrounding bowl games. Now, I don't think you probably get there. However, if you can pull off an upset against Wisconsin this week, maybe you can. I mean, you played Michigan, you can win that game. You play Purdue, you should win that game. So you really only need to pull off 2 upsets in order to get into that conversation here. Certainly doable for a team as well coached as you are. Moving on to Purdue, yes, You lost to Illinois. I get it. I understand. You want to win. However, that was the best that your football team has looked this season by far. And a lot of that was probably Illinois looking ahead to Michigan at home this week. However, that new quarterback that you guys decided to play this week also, I think, had a significant part in it. He played very, very well, ran the ball well, threw the ball better in the second half. And if he had a little bit more experience, you probably convert that 2-point play to win the game. I thought that Maccabee, the running back, was open enough to where you could complete the pass and him probably get into the end zone on that play to end the game. However, didn't pull the trigger, got sacked, game was over. Ohio State, obviously, you would like to win the game, but you guys played just about as well as you can in a loss. Now, as I said when I was talking about Oregon and the Scarlett Johansson tier, you guys got a lot of breaks in this game. You really did. However, if you were at home, and even without those breaks, I think you win the game. I think the road was far more important than any of the breaks that happened within the game. And I got to be honest with you, I don't have a whole lot to talk about with this game on your end. I don't think it's going to matter all that much. I think you're still probably going to cruise, relatively speaking, to an 11-1 record and probably rematch with Oregon in the Big Ten championship game, where Oregon is going to have to travel 2 time zones over, and you are going to have like a 4-hour drive. And I think you win that rematch if you play each other again. So I think that everything is still in front of you if you're Ohio State. All of your goals are still achievable. You're probably going to go 11-1, like I've already said. If you make it to the Big Ten championship game and you are playing Oregon, I think you beat Oregon again in the Big Ten championship game. So if this was the 4-team playoff, then maybe this would be a little bit more concerning because you'd be looking at 11-1, maybe not making the Big Ten championship game, etc., etc. However, this isn't the 4-team playoff. The fact of the matter is that you could drop to Indiana as well and still cruise to being the 8th or 9th ranked team in the country. It's just a fact of reality. You're going to make the playoffs. It's almost impossible for you to miss the playoffs. So my advice to you would be to fucking chill. You don't need to be going for Ryan Day's throat. You don't need to be calling for him to be fired, which is stuff that I've heard fans talk about. I've heard several fans say that whether Ryan Day keeps the job or not is going to come down to the Penn State game. Never mind the fact that you might also play a top 10 and potentially undefeated Indiana. And then maybe if Michigan can get some wins here, a ranked Michigan team to end the season, okay? But even if you lose to Penn State, and even if you then lose to Michigan and you're 9-3 and you miss the playoffs, Ryan Day's not going fucking anywhere. Ryan Day might be the best coach in football whose name isn't Kirby Smart. It would be idiotic to fire him for going 9-3 this year. Okay? If you go 9-3 in back-to-back years and you keep losing to Michigan and you keep losing the top 5 opponents, then maybe you move on. But right now, Ryan Day, in all honesty, is probably the number 2 coach in college football. And acting like because they have a down year, which first off, this isn't going to fucking be a down year. You're going to end up 11-1, so chill. But even if this does become a down year, one down year in, 5 or 6 years as a head coach where you're making the playoffs and competing for national championships legitimately, basically every year, you're going to fire that because he has one down year? He would have a job anywhere in the country that is not Georgia or Texas instantly if you fired him. Anyway, rant about that over. Really quickly, Minnesota won the game on the road on the West Coast. Big win for your chances to make a bowl game. You got Maryland this week, then Illinois, Rutgers, Penn State, Wisconsin. You need I believe, 2 wins in order to get to bowl eligibility. I think you can probably beat Maryland and Rutgers. Probably going to lose to Illinois, in my opinion. Probably going to lose to Penn State. Last week of the season, rivalry game, who knows? But by that point, you're already bowl eligible, and that is the goal. Illinois, you got some shit to figure out on defense. That was bad. That was real bad. But we'll talk about that later, because only half of your team is in the good section of this video. The other half is in a different section, okay? Your offense is good, genuinely. Michigan's defense isn't. So you're going to have a real chance to put up 27 to 35-ish points, and Michigan is probably not going to be able to replicate that. So you've got a real chance to win this week. That is a ranked matchup. All of a sudden, you're 6-1. You'll probably be ranked inside the top 20. Big time win if you can get it this week. Maybe the most important game in terms of what is at stake for the two programs playing in all of college football this next week is Illinois and Michigan. Offensively, you were very, very good. Okay, I apologize for this, but I got to leave for work here in a couple of minutes. So we're going to have to breeze through these last 2 sections. I spent too much time talking about the first 2 sections. The bad. Washington got obliterated. It didn't look good. I thought they should have won the game. Maybe the travel had to do with it, but honestly, the travel wasn't that bad. You were going from the western half of the central time zone from Pacific time. It really shouldn't have been that bad. Either way, it got blown out. Emotional win the past week, going on the road. Iowa's a tough place to play. I get it. I understand it. You're not that level of program that can overcome those types of things right now. Rutgers got obliterated by Wisconsin. I thought you'd be able to keep it close. I was wrong. Still think you've got a good shot at getting to the bowl game. UCLA looked much better the past few weeks, but you haven't been able to get that victory that really sort of signals that maybe this guy is the guy at the head coach spot. Moving on to the final tier in terms of the rankings here, the ugly tier, and that is, of course, Maryland and Illinois' defense. When it comes to Maryland, we'll start there here. Again, we're going to go pretty quickly, but when it comes to Maryland, this is a bad football team. You're going to be looking for a new head coach after this year. Loxley's out the goddamn window. It's just a fact of reality at this point. It's not going to work out. I think if this format, where you didn't have to play Ohio State, Michigan State, Penn State, Michigan every year, had been adopted sooner, I think Mike Loxley could have potentially figured shit out a little bit more and gotten some 8 or 9 win seasons under his belt. So this year, clearly a rebuilding year. Everybody knew it was going to be a rebuilding year. But if he had gotten those wins and those good seasons under his belt, then I think maybe you could wait it out a little bit here, because I do think he's a good coach, but it's just not going to work out, and you've got to go a different direction. Illinois, defensively, the only thing I really want to say here is that, yes, it was very, very bad. Michigan has a significantly worse offense than Purdue. Michigan, even if Jack Tuttle comes out and plays like I think he can, Michigan is still not going to have a very good passing game. They're still going to have massive problems along the offensive line. And now your defense that just got embarrassed this past week is going to come into this game extraordinarily motivated. That very well could be a recipe for success. Moving on here to the Big Ten Power Rankings. We have a new number 1 for the first time this season. Oregon is at 1. Ohio State is at 2. Penn State is at 3, remaining unchanged. Also at number 4, Indiana. Nebraska up 1 spot due to Illinois' struggle with Purdue as they fall 1 spot to number 6. Wisconsin up 2 spots to number 7. Iowa, the biggest leaper this week, moving up 6 spots to number 8. 9, USC. They looked very, very good at home. 10, Rutgers, down 2 spots after getting destroyed by Wisconsin. Minnesota up 3 spots, handling business on the road. Washington down 5 spots after getting obliterated by Iowa. Michigan down 1 spot. Michigan State down as well 1 spot. Doesn't really change my opinion on both of those teams. Just kind of I felt like I had to move a couple of teams ahead of you. Northwestern up 1 spot to number 15. Purdue up 1 spot to 16. Maryland down 2 spots. And UCLA remains stagnant at the bottom of the conference, although it's getting real close with a couple of these teams down there. Moving on to my top 15 rankings for all of college football. Number 1 remains unchanged. Texas is number 1. Oregon is up 4 spots, leapfrogging 2 SEC teams and 2 Big Ten teams to go to number 2. Ohio State falls down to number 3. Georgia falls down 1 spot to number 4. Penn State up 2 spots after, in all honesty, an impressive victory against USC on the road. Alabama down 1 spot after they struggled with South Carolina. Notre Dame up 1 spot. LSU up 3 spots after beating Ole Miss. Clemson up 1 spot after handling business. Iowa State up 2 spots. Tennessee down 4 spots after nearly losing this week. Miami, who I've already declared a fraud, up 1 spot. BYU up 2 spots. They might be the best team in the Big 12. Indiana in for this first time at number 14, as well as Boise State, who was my G5 pick last week. They are now just 15. And my G5 pick in terms of if Boise State were to lose in the championship game for their conference, who would then be the next team up to get that 5th auto bid, I think that would be Army. I do think Army has a very good chance to go 11-0 in the regular season and end up in the American championship game. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. To this point, I remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.